Hello everybody and welcome to another video. So today I wanted to talk about the fantasy setting in the Age of Sigmar. And I'm not going to get into specifics of the narrative or something like that. Instead, I'm going to talk about the types of fantasy because the changeover to Age of Sigmar obviously destroyed the old world and gave us a new world, and it's very different, and all of that is obvious to anybody who's been involved with this. But as I've been thinking about this recently, and I see a lot of things thrown about the nature of the story, it got me thinking about the different types of fantasy and how they relate and how GW has classically used and employed the various tropes of the fantasy genre in their games, in Warhammer specifically. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to explore that in a little more detail. So, let's get into it. So, when I say types of fantasy, what I mean is that, fantasy isn't some hegemonic thing. It's not one specific set of themes and stories or settings or anything like that. It's much like any other genre, like sci-fi or other types of genres. There are lots of little sub-groupings within it. And what's important about it is not just the setting, right? Does the world look like our world? Does it look like medieval, Europe or something like that? That's all honestly window dressing. I think we tend to think of that as being important, but I don't think it is. And I'll give you an easy example. Most people think of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings as fairly classic fantasy, but it doesn't look anything like Earth. I mean, it's even called Middle Earth or whatever, but it doesn't really look like Earth in the way that there's no real strong, medieval European roots there. There's a few things in some parts of the world that are somewhat recognizable, but a lot of the world is very different and distinct. But we still think of that as fantasy, or sort of a standard brand of fantasy, I guess. It's about the verisimilitude, the expectations of the world, okay? And that's what I really want to dig into. Because what's interesting to me isn't the nature of, are there floating rocks with trees on them? Or are we on an alien planet? Or is there magic everywhere? All of those things are elements that can be employed in different ways. What's interesting to me is the expectations of the narrative. Okay? And so though there are other types of fantasy stories than what I'm going to cover here. But I'm not going to touch on things like wuxia or investigative or horror or stuff like that. Not that those aren't valid subgenres. They're just not as cogent to this discussion because they have somewhat overlap on the Venn diagram of narrative expectations. Somewhat. So we're going to stick to basically 4 types of fantasy, and we'll get through them in a second. And the important part is, what does the hero's journey look like in these worlds? What's the challenges they're going to encounter? Where did they come from? Where are they going to? What does their journey look like? Right? So I have these 4 names for these. These aren't universal. It's not like I can go look this up in an encyclopedia. You may have different names, but what I'm hoping is that they'll sort of appropriately put a name around a collection of ideas. So let's start with the classics. And I say the classics, which is an ironic term, but these are really the 2 genres that grew out of the basically post-Tolkien, okay? So you had this big movement of the one on the right, which is sword and sorcery, and that sort of morphed through gaming into heroic fantasy. And these 2 have some overlap, but not a huge amount. So let's kind of get into it. So heroic fantasy is probably the one we're most familiar with, because it's sort of become the baseline. And heroic fantasy is kind of what D&D is. Like, D&D itself is a story of heroic fantasy. You've got these bold, brave heroes, adventurers, who are set apart from society, who rise from ordinary backgrounds and through tragedy or circumstance or whatever, face a series of challenges in their life, overcome them, and achieve greatness, right? In a heroic fantasy story, the hero can generally expect to triumph, right? The hero lives, they win, and they might lose people along the way, but in the end, the story is usually mostly a happy one, right? Not always the case, but general assumptions here is what I'm talking about. Not every single thing ever. This tends to hew more to the medieval European norms. It's not always the case, but many heroic fantasy stories employ these sorts of tropes, and they look a lot like version. Even if the geography doesn't, the world, the technology, the I want to say like the roles people play in society. There we go. Look a lot like sort of those norms. And as I said, I think this is the most common because it's sort of got the traditional hero's journey in it, right? You have a normal person, starts out as could be anybody, and then they kind of rise, and there are things that come in their way, and then they triumph, and they are victorious, and accolades are given all around. Sword and sorcery is the other big one in the background of sort of modern fantasy. And the base presumptions of sword and sorcery are the same world as heroic fantasy, but through the scanner darkly, right? It's a pessimistic take on the same sort of world, although they're often not set in that same medieval time. But the basic conception is there are no real heroes, right? The world, humans, are in general greedy and sort of motivated by baser instincts, right? They're not out for the causes of good and justice. They're out for bloodlust or just lust, good old-fashioned, or revenge or something like that, right? Conan the Barbarian is like the classic sword and sorcery story, although there are many tales like that. The villains often triumph in this. And even if they don't, the heroes don't usually get out all right. Extreme loss is suffered. Things are bloody and gritty and grim, right? The world is dark. People suffer. And goodness generally isn't rewarded, right? Like, good people are naive and stupid. And for their goodness, they usually only have a short life of pain and probably death to look forward to. Game of Thrones treads on a lot of sword and sorcery tropes, although its trappings look more like heroic fantasy. There is one other thing that is a combination of these two elements, of these two classic themes. And that's Warhammer, right? The old school Warhammer we were familiar with more or less from when the setting started. So say about 1989 when they finally really started solidifying some kind of story up until the end times, right? The world was more or less a mix of heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery. Heroes rose from normal people. The world had these general medieval norms. Heroes generally triumphed to maintain the status quo. Chaos was always more powerful in the old world. Like, there were just... They just outnumbered mortals by thousands and thousands to one, and each of them was more powerful than any one human. And yet, humans and dwarves and elves, the good guys, generally triumphed through sort of a mix of, like, grit and tenacity, right? But the world very often dipped into that sword and sorcery world as well. If you look at, like, the role-playing game, right, it was very much like this, where things are gritty and dark. The morality of the world was gray. People were motivated not just by virtue or the desire for peace or justice. They're motivated by a lot of their own personal darker instincts, even the good guys, right? So I think that where their real sort of the traction for that world and its uniqueness, if that can be a thing, was that they took these two concepts and synergized them together to make one world, where you could have heroes, but you could also have this sort of gritty world in the background. And different races might have played in these different spaces to differing amounts, right? Like, Bretonia was more heroic fantasy, although it got more sword and sorcery in 6th edition if you compare it to, like, 5th or something, right? And so on and so forth. Whereas, like, the Empire, especially in, like, Altdorf, most of the people there were, it's really this gritty, dirty setting. And there's lots of grime hiding in the cracks of that world. Okay. Let's move on. So, what's old is new. And so the reason I thought it was ironic that the last two were called the classics is because there are two much older genres of fantasy that go way back, right? And that's epic fantasy and mythic fantasy. So epic fantasy is basically the stuff of sort of Arthurian legend, though there are many others out there. But they're these sorts of epic tales. The heroes are mighty and powerful and beyond the common man, right? They are something held aloft. They are gleaming, plate-clad warriors atop a hill, standing before evil, unflinching. Fear does not touch their soul, right? And these sorts of stories focus on the struggle between good and evil, right? Those two things are not in question. Like, morality is not gray. There is good and there is evil in the world, and it is good's job to battle it, and it is evil's job to destroy the world. And that is more or less the how it goes. Virtue is generally rewarded. People who are good generally profit, I guess would be the word, although that's the wrong thing to say, but, get ahead in life, I guess. And death is by sacrifice, Here's an easy, fun thing to separate, like, sort of heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and epic fantasy. If a person gets a cut, just a hero in the story gets a wound, right? What happens? In heroic fantasy, the cut might impair them for some time. They might have a tougher fight on their hands, but in the end, they'll overcome it, right? It's simply a cut on their arm, but it'll heal. In sword and sorcery, it will greatly impair them, and it will probably fester, and even the mightiest hero can be laid low by a simple blade cut. That might sound familiar to those of you who've watched Game of Thrones. In epic fantasy, it wouldn't even be a thing. Heroes get slashed and cut and injured, and that is simply par for the course, and they bear it all with a smile and a grim determination to continue to fight the forces of evil, right? So you can see these themes come out in lots of little touches, like the way that our heroes are wounded. And that was a physical example, but the mental examples could be just as true. So death wouldn't just come about through some random disease or, accident or falling off a horse. It would be a noble sacrifice, right? To save others or for something like that. The motivations in epic fantasy are pure. People seek to make the world a better place, to defeat evil, often for no other reason than it is there, and all that good men must do, or all that, whatever, that thing about evil succeeding is good men do nothing. I'm misquoting it, but you get the idea. And the other one, maybe sort of one of the older, if not the oldest style, I guess, is mythic fantasy, right? And mythic fantasy is sort of that next jump up. The heroes are demigods, just far beyond mortals. Not just sort of the peak of mortal men who are beyond, but the heroes are men and women who have been touched by the gods themselves. They have powers that no amount of training or effort could ever get you to, right? These are the stories of Gilgamesh and Hercules and things like this, right? The worlds that they inhabit and visit are often beyond imagination, right? For ancient myth, it was visiting the heavens and the tops of great mountains and the lands of the gods and giant mazes with minotaurs in the middle and seas with monsters that you had to sail between with roiling, Scylla, I don't know, and Charybdis, right? These were the stories of mythic fantasy. Things completely beyond the expectations of the normal world. And the other important part about mythic fantasy is that the gods take a direct hand, right? They are the gods are very active, not only in often birthing the heroes and villains, but also in simply intervening on a daily basis in our protagonists' lives. So because the story shifts to be about gods and these these mythic heroes, the day-to-day tends to fall away. The common man, the farmer, the smith, the cobbler, whatever, aren't relevant in these stories. They aren't characters because they're not important. We have in sort of heroic fantasy, you have these two sets of, you need always a comparison, right? You need the normal man to compare the hero to. But in mythic fantasy, the hero is compared to the gods. And so you don't need the regular man anymore, except perhaps to be in the background and to stare slack-jawed at the might and power of the hero, right? Like, they're not narratively relevant. They might occasionally show up just to be like, my goodness, it's Heracles or Hercules or whatever name you happen to be going by now. So the story has shifted up. And as a result, what happens day to day? How are we growing crops? Who's making shoes? Who cares is the answer, right? It doesn't matter. The story is about these great mythic trials and challenges of the struggle of man's place in the world of the gods. Now, I'm sure you can guess where I'm going to go here. And I think that the real shift in the narrative of Age of Sigmar is that now these are the two that have synergized. I mean, look at the cover compared to these two images. In these two images, what we have is these singular figures doing incredible tasks, right? In the previous images, and those were all just searches. I literally searched for these terms and looked at the images. And when I searched for heroic fantasy, what I found a lot of was, people going into dungeons, fighting lots of undead, armies, stuff like that. When I searched for sword and sorcery, it's a lot of, obviously, like TNA and stuff like that, and people with, like, lots of skeletons around them, or, slavering orcs surrounding our hero who's, wounded, or a muscle-bound, sort of Brahm-painted guy. With these two, it's about these singular moments, this pure, distilled struggle of good against evil. And when I look at the cover of Age of Sigmar, it's exactly what I see. The representation of two gods going against each other, right? And in every army that's been released, we've seen this shift, this focus to the gods. Nagash and Death, Sigmar, and the Order and Stormcast. The Chaos gods, who've always played a big part, but now even have a bigger role through their servants. And now Gork and, the Iron Jaws and the Fist of Gork being a new special character. So, what this has become, when the sort of story first shifted, one of the things I often said on the show on Warhammer Weekly was, I want to know what the day-to-day life is. I want to know why they're not telling me about that. Like, what's going on in Aezerheim? What does the average life of a person look like? That was because I hadn't realized yet that that's not what the story was about anymore. And again, I'm not passing any value judgment. You can like or dislike any of these. I'm not saying one is better than the other or anything else. I'm simply making a statement that I think this is why the story is being told as it is. The story has shifted up. And in the same way, it's now this combination of epic and mythic fantasy. The tale of gods and their children fighting, right? The eternal struggle of good against evil, order against chaos, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's thinly veiled good and evil, right? And a lot of that, that's what's going on here. That's what has been synergized. We went away from the old paradigm, and we've synergized two new types of fantasy to get the Age of Sigmar. Okay? So let's look a little deeper. The tone is key, right? So take a look at this image. It's this singular figure standing before a big dragon, right? So the question is, what happens next. All right? And what happens next changes a lot based on the type of fantasy that you're in, the type of story you're in. So in heroic fantasy, this dragon has probably come about at the end of a long road. This hero has faced many challenges to get to this point, to face down this dragon. And what's probably happens is a mighty battle ensues, the hero is victorious, and a reward is bestowed, right, against the odds. And the reward will be something commensurate with what a sort of real-world benefit might be. He may, become a king or something like that, right? It's a very grounded story, except for the fact that we allow the hero to achieve these incredible feats if they earn them. They have to work their way from nobody or whatever, from base to achieving this greatness, right? It's not just something they are or do. If this was sword and sorcery, a fight like this could be very unexpected. That is to say, sword and sorcery can often present our heroes with very unexpected challenges. All of a sudden, terrible villains and monsters of unexpected power can be confronted because the bad people in the world are usually far more potent than the good people. And even if the hero is victorious, he or she is probably injured in some terrible way going forward. That could be physical, that could be mental, right? But they're going to carry the scars of this victory forever, because the only reward in sword and sorcery is suffering, right? Good deeds are punished, not rewarded. Again, it sees the world darkly. If it's epic fantasy, then this hero has sought out this dragon, right? He seeks him to prove that evil must be smited. This dragon has been terrorizing the countryside, and so this brave hero will stride out to smite the creature. What the hero did to get to this point doesn't really matter much. It is about this struggle, not about the road that got us here. The victory will probably be complete. The hero will vanquish the evil, and the reward will be magnificent. It will be mighty. It will be this person will be a king of kings, right? Or rewarded with great power, or whatever, right? If this were mythic fantasy, then the dragon is undoubtedly the servant of a dark god that has been manipulated into this fight, just as the hero has been manipulated into this fight. May win, may lose. Myths just as often end with the heroes dying as it does winning, but it doesn't matter. In either way, the tale is somehow legendary and becomes instructive to everybody else who hears it. If the hero is victorious, the reward is simply more trials, more travails, more tribulation, right? Because in the end, life in the world of mythic fantasy is a constant challenge, ruled over by capricious gods who seek only to test those that are less than them, right? So it's the same situation, but what we care about, the nature of the narrative, the beats that the story hits, in each one are different. And we see this sort of same thing well beyond fantasy. Like, I'm doing this in the scope of a fantasy discussion. But the reality is that all sorts of narratives can follow this, right? Consider the very simple paradigm of someone running into, like, a hero going into a building armed with the gun to, like, shoot up a bunch of bad guys in an action movie, right? If the world is sort of this grim, gritty world, then the hero is going to get shot, they're going to fail, they're going to suffer, they are going to, whatever, it's going to be very difficult, they'll have to be very careful. But if it's like some sort of epic fantasy type action movie, right? The hero's going to run in there and jump around and do flips and gun everybody down and be untouched by bullets other than a few scratches or whatever, right? So we see these sorts of same tropes, these same themes played out in lots of ways we tell stories. So let's bring this all the way home. Fantasy in the Age of Sigmar. What do I think this all means? I think the current style of fantasy means that basically we'll focus on themes and elements that are unlike the old world. And I don't just mean the setting being the realms and being these crazy things, but I mean the tone and the themes of the story and what they explore will be very different. We'll see lots more gods and incredible creatures and their interactions with, the life of man on a daily basis. And the people we focus on in the story will be these much bigger heroes. I think we've already seen that. When you look at the types of stories we've told, the types of stories that are told in the books, they're the stories of heroes, of basically men and women forged by the gods to go fight and do their bidding, right? In almost all the cases. The Slann, who are almost gods at this point or whatever, literally remember their children into existence, right? Sigmar quite literally reforged the Stormcast from normal, men and women into these near immortal warriors of incredible power. Chaos infuses their children, as they always have, but now even to a greater level, right? Whereas before, like, the Chaos Warriors would seek to become a demon prince, now look at all these different levels of how epic these Chaos heroes have become and what they do to gain that dark power, right? They are as epically evil as the heroes are epically good. So the point being, I think there'll be a lot less gray in the new world. Like, I'm not to say there won't be none. I think Warhammer is always a story of some amount of moral grayness. But I think when you look at the broad brushstrokes of the world, it's a much less gray world. Averheim, or whatever, Space Station Sigmar, is a plane of goodness and light and the heavens where Sigmar has protected his children. Now, there's suffering and loss and all of that, as would be expected, because we've brought in those mythic elements, right? Where the hero's reward is simply more trials. But when you look at the story of Sigmar, if you read the original world, or the original age post the end times, was called the Age of Myth, right? And Sigmar himself went through these Herculean, whatever, trials to that he had to constantly go. He was already incredibly powerful. He wasn't gaining power. He was just undergoing these trials because that's what mythic heroes do, right? And I would bring up this image. If anything, if any single image, I think, shows exactly what I mean about the world that we live in now, it is this. And this is Archaon, who is himself, this epic, mythic villain, meeting a god beast, this dragon that is just beyond reason in size, right? And he tames this creature, binds him to his will, right? This is the stuff where, like, what the cobbler's doing in town anymore, it's just not relevant to this type of story, because this isn't a story about normal people. It's a story about the clash of these mighty ideals, these themes of what good and evil and being, and what the gods will their servants to do as they fight against each other. So, and again, all of that's not to say that one of these things is better than the other or anything like that. You can like whatever brand of fantasy you want. And so this isn't a judgment that this one is better or worse. You could like it more, you could like it less. That's just fine. Mine is simply, I think my point is simply to discuss how I think the narrative is shifted. And really put a finger on the themes, put a point on the themes, and why we're seeing these different elements in the stories. So, there you go. That's my thoughts. I would love to hear yours. As always, put them down in the comments below. If you have any other thoughts on, if you felt like I missed something or I've overlooked a particular element of the stories, I would love to hear about it. So, thank you all very much for watching. As always, we'll see you next time.